Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about the role of oil and gas in the ongoing major conflicts, especially the role of pipelines for oil in the Middle East and the need for energy and the petro-aggression of the major countries. With my guest, Charlotte Dennett. She is the daughter of America's first master spy in the Middle East. She is a Burlington-based author, investigative journalist, and attorney. Her latest book, just now out in paperback, is Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. She and her husband, Gerard Colby, are authors of Thy Will Be Done, The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller, and Evangelism in the Age of Oil. She has been described by Time magazine as an expert in resource-based politics and has been inducted into Who's Who in America. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Wonderful to be on your show. Thank you.
I just finished a most superb book that truly explained so many of the major conflicts that are going on, the wars that we've had, and how oil is such a significant factor, and the pipelines to get oil from the Middle East to the West, and how so much of American politics cover up the role of the oil companies in promoting these wars as a war on terror, a war to protect democracy. You truly, with your many, many stories of what is going on, what has gone on for the last century, really presents a totally different picture than we normally hear. Why do you believe that oil is such a crucial ingredient for the economic, military, and political powers and has really been behind the wars in Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Israel, and Ukraine?
The reason I say it with certainty goes back to my trying to figure out the death of my father. But I will say first, to answer your question, the reason you don't know about it, and I do this with audience, I say, why is oil so important to us? And they'll talk about it's fuel for our home and our industries and our car. An audience will say all of that, but they don't say the major point. It's the fuel of the military. Period. Okay? Our military and militaries around the world, they are the largest consumers of oil. But they don't want that reliance on oil to be exposed. And so they're all into deep competition with each other. To this day, despite all our efforts to move on to new energies, they're still out there. And that's why my subtitle involves the deadly politics of the great game for oil in my book, Follow the Pipelines. It's because these wars are fought for oil, and they know, every leader knows, that you're not going to get moms to happily give up their sons, daughters, husbands, spouses. They're not going to give them up if they knew that these wars for oil and for the profits of the oil companies. So they come up with pretexts. And of course, America's most favorite, and now I would say worn out pretext is, oh, we're all in there to protect democracy. Give me a break. To get into it as to why I say this with certainty is because going back to my father's death, right before his plane crashed, which was in Ethiopia, he was at a top secret mission to Saudi Arabia. And I was able to find his last letter home and his last report, which were preserved and saved for my mother. And in it, it describes his visit there to inspect the oil reserves and all the installations that the Americans had set up in Saudi Arabia. At the time of his visit, he was to determine the route of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline. It's called TAP line. What I learned just from these reports, or letters, I should say, was that it was hugely controversial, that there were other countries that were deeply jealous, and these were our own allies. These were the British, the French, and the Soviets. These were our allies during World War II. As soon as it was over, he was predicting that there would be, quote, a real free-for-all, and he meant for the oil. And sure enough, he wrote that in 1943. The other thing I was able to do was I sued the CIA for information through FOIA. And one of the things I got was what's called his analysis, simply analysis, of what he was expected to do as a spy for the Office of Strategic Services, later became the Central Intelligence Group at the time of his death, and shortly afterwards the CIA. One of his analyses, which was heavily redacted, I finally got it unredacted, was we have to protect the oil at all costs. At all costs. Very important 3 words, which is a meme that's continued all the way up to the present. I still hear them saying we have to protect the oil at all costs. Well, what are the costs in terms of human life and treasure? It's just astounding. But at any rate, back to Tapline. So the Americans had an exclusive concession for oil in Saudi Arabia, and that's what aroused the jealousies of all other powers, because it was exclusive. FDR had worked out a very nice arrangement with Ibn Saud, the leader of Saudi Arabia, that no other country was going to move in on them, especially the Saudis did not want the Brits in there. So where was this pipeline that was going to carry really valuable Saudi oil? Where was it going to terminate? What's fascinating is its terminal point was either going to be Lebanon, where he was stationed, which is immediately north of Israel, which at the time was Palestine, soon to become Israel. That's when I learned that the security of the pipeline weighed heavily in their calculations. You don't want a pipeline to go through an area where there are going to be disturbances or where there are going to be efforts to attack the pipeline, which went on a lot during World War I. He was recommending that the pipeline terminate in Lebanon, not in Haifa, primarily because there was a huge amount of unrest there in Haifa. The Jews were fighting the Brits. They wanted them out. They wanted their own independence. And they were also finding the Arabs who didn't like the Jews coming in and setting up a homeland. So there's the context. There's the beginning of the conflict. Well, actually, it was after World War I. But that alerted me to the importance of protecting a pipeline, because you got to get the oil to market, right? For some reason, pipelines are overlooked. They're absolutely critical. Well, pipelines and tankers, but most reliability is on pipelines. It's cheaper and so on.
Sadly, the new finds of oil fields off the shore of Lebanon and Israel and in the West Bank is contributing to some of the current conflict, but yet in your story of your father and the history of these pipelines, it also gives one a better understanding of what you might say was part of the beginning of the Cold War, because Russia wanted a pipeline to get energy. The Brits and Americans and French wanted a pipeline. There was controversy, and you also gave some background of why America has been so supportive of some of the governments in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, particularly when you discussed the murder of a Saudi journalist.
Khashoggi.
What's interesting about your father, Daniel Dennett, who had a code name, but he, as you said, traveled into the Middle East and lived in the Middle East. You were actually born in Lebanon, and the plane crash is very suspicious. All the official reports you point out say it was an accident, and yet it was an experienced pilot. They said that the weather was okay, and you still believe sabotage was involved.
Yeah, and I appreciate your zeroing in on that important issue. Of course, it's very important to me. I have not fully solved the mystery, although I have a working hypothesis of what happened. And so what I did a lot of work at the National Archives. They're located in College Park, Maryland. It's one of my favorite places in the world to go to. It's just extraordinary. You can go in there, and a lot of the OSS reports were declassified, believe it or not. So they're a wealth of information, and a lot of my father's reports are there. as well. That's how I was able to document a lot of this, how important the pipeline was. As for the Cold War, another great clue that I found was a New York Times report, and I just pulled it out right now. It was dated March 2nd, 1947. It was in the Sunday edition. It had a map of the region, and the title of the article, Pipeline for U.S. Adds to Middle East Issues. And then below that, and this is 1947, okay? My father was to die 2 weeks later. And the subtitle is Oil Concessions Raise Questions Involving Position of Russia. So you see, the great game was going on. It was very much geared, of course, against the Russians, the Soviet Union. But what I found out, a lot of it was not about ideology. It was just about who's going to get theirs and who's in the way. And so this was already going on by 1947. Yeah, the Russians were nosing in. They were nosing around not only Saudi Arabia, but Ethiopia. So the plane, I got a copy of the accident report. It was extremely helpful, and the writer of it could not come to a definitive conclusion, and he didn't rule out sabotage. Later, when I was in the archives, one of the archivists took me to a meeting at Fort Myers nearby, a meeting of ex-spooks. That was nice of him. He took me in, and I met one of them who was very aware of my father's work and told me it was a huge loss, and the reason was because he was so well-versed in the history of the region. He could speak Arabic. He read the Quran. He was unusual, okay? So he said it was a great loss. And then he said, and I suspected he had a little bit too much wine at this point, he said, we always thought it was sabotage but could never prove it. Wow, that was so helpful to me because, I was on this lone crusade, convinced that there was something fishy about this plane crash. And then to have him confirm it just made me redouble my efforts. And so then I analyzed who was on the plane, what was on the plane, because I got the accident report, and they itemized all the elements.
And if somebody wants to know all the details, which we don't have time to cover, they can read your superb, excellent book, Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. And because the book is talking about the oil connection to the superpowers, you have included over a dozen pipeline maps covering the area from World War II to the present, and they really show the conflict about which countries should a pipeline go through. You explain in your chapters why one was chosen over another. It's incredible history of why we are still having conflicts to this day. We mentioned your father having been a master spy in this region in the 30s and 40s. Yet, with his death, he wasn't honored by the CIA until very recently. Could you describe why they finally recognized your father's role?
It may have happened when I was suing the CIA through FOIA for documents. I was in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York City. The lower court judge had effectively closed the case, and I wanted to appeal it. So I was in there. There was a New York Times reporter and a Village Voice reporter who happened to be sitting in the room, and I addressed my concern that the American people are not being told the whole story, and it's very important. I said this to the judges. So when I walked out, they both came after me, and they ended up writing stories about my quest. Shortly thereafter, the CIA historian did a whole segment on my father and said that he should be recognized for the work that he did. I cannot explain why he was not previously recognized. Maybe he was forgotten. He was 37 years old when he died in that plane crash. That part I haven't figured out. Ever since the CIA historian was pushing for his recognition and being included on the Wall of Honor, which is in the CIA Langley headquarters, every year they honor the fallen. So they finally did that. They actually called me down and said, please participate. So I went down.
Congratulations.
He's the first fallen star. That's how he's honored. And they've even said they've named a room after him just because of his extraordinary knowledge of the region.
And we are going to talk more about this important issue when we return in a moment with my guest, Charlotte Dennett.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310 559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Charlotte Dennett. She is author of Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. She is also an attorney and an investigative journalist. Your book reads like an investigative journalist because not only were you trying to find out what your dad was doing and why you think he was basically murdered, you also describe why we have had so many conflicts based on oil, and that ranges from even Ukraine today to the Bush administration's disastrous invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and how the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline for Caspian Sea energy created conflicts, both for the Russians, for Americans, for other nations. The Iraq petroleum pipeline that was closed in 1948 from Iraq to Israel, why these things were started, why they existed, why they didn't get built. There are so many pipelines. How do you describe the conflicts in these other countries of this area and what has gone on in the past and what is going on now?
Yeah, I say follow the pipelines because they'll lead to answers. By the way, if there is a particular hot spot in the world, and there are a lot of them right now, of course, in the Middle East and the Caucasus and around the Red Sea, and that means Africa. There are conflicts raging. Type in the name of the country and then type in oil and pipeline, and you'll find answers. They're there, even though the subject is very covered up.
You describe this conflict going back to 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. Could
Correct.
you explain that?
Yeah, sure. But let me just finish one thought. You cannot build an energy corridor for pipelines unless there is stability. There can be no violence in the region. This map that showed up in the New York Times, its title is A New Pipeline for the Middle East. This is March 2, 1947. Well, I was focusing on Tapline, the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, but I saw there was this other pipeline that ran from Iraq, and it split in two, and the northern part went to Lebanon, and the southern part went to Palestine, and it was called the Iraq Petroleum Pipeline. And one of the things that I do is I find out when the pipelines were built, but obviously they had to be conceived earlier. For instance, this Iraq Petroleum Pipeline, it was built in the early 1930s, but it was conceived much earlier. So I kept going back and trying to figure out when that would have been. And one of the things I found out is that World War I was largely fought for Britain to get access and control the oil of Iraq. Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty. That means he was the head of the Navy before he became Prime Minister. He recognized he had to change his Navy's reliance on coal to oil. Britain had plenty of coal. It had no oil. So one of the things he said, all right, we've got to do this conversion because it was cheaper and more efficient. We got to do this, but we're going to face a sea of troubles, which is exactly what happened. So in World War I, a quote, unquote, first-class war aim, end quote, for the Brits was to control the oil of Iraq. And they succeeded. Lawrence of Arabia helped that whole story, if you understand it from that perspective, how the Brits got the Arabs to fight the Turks in World War I, and they were promised independence in return for the help. Well, they didn't get it. That's a whole other story. It's explained.
There are so many stories to explain and discuss, and I can only highly recommend that people read each chapter to get a better understanding of the conflicts in every part of that area of the Middle East.
But let me just complete the Balfour Declaration. After the Brits got control of the oil, they had to figure out, where are we shipping the oil to? How can we get it to market? And they already knew this, I'm sure. But the point is that the fastest and best route was to run a pipeline from Iraq to Haifa, Palestine. Then you have the Balfour Balfour Declaration, which is a letter from Lord Balfour, who was the former foreign minister, deeply steeped in oil politics. He understood it, and it was a letter. This is often not said. The Balfour Declaration is a commitment on the part of Britain to create a Jewish home in Palestine, okay? But it's just a letter from Lord Balfour, Foreign Secretary, to Lord Walter Rothschild of the famous Rothschild banking and oil family. They were heavily involved at the time in supporting Jewish immigration to Palestine and creating colonies there. That is where I was able to make the connection to the Brits wanting a Western enclave to protect that pipeline. And these were the Jews that had been rescued from the Holocaust. They're always told that this was created out of deep concern for the suffering of the Jews. And I remember talking to one Jewish intellectual who said, oh my God, I always wondered, why would the Brits care so much about Jews when they were suppressing us all over the place? They were very anti-Semitic. Why this sudden turnaround? Well, it was because that was the pretext, protecting the Jews. But the real reason was to have a safe enclave populated by European Jews who could be more relied on for alliances and so on with the West.
In your book, you certainly provided a lot of detail, research, data. You've created documentation where you got the information that gives us a better understanding of some of the actions of the various countries over the decades. But you also previously wrote a book with your husband, Thy Will Be Done, The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller, and the Evangelism in the Age of Oil, where you talked about the destruction of the Amazon and the genocide of Amazonian native Indians because of oil. You didn't ignore another part of the world.
This is true, and that was my deep education. We worked on that book for 18 years.
And you talked about how missionaries have been part of the conflict of destruction of the ecosystems and genocide of the local people.
We were looking at this evangelical missionary organization that was working among the tribes, the very tribes that were getting hit militarily. They were victims of genocide. We wanted to know why they seemed to turn a blind eye to what was happening to their own quote-unquote wards. And what we eventually found out is that they were allied with Western corporate power. Their explanation was always that they raised the money through the church as well. It's not just that. We stumbled on the Rockefeller connection. That's a whole other story. What we found out is that they were based in the Southwest. The Summer Institute of Linguistics, very fancy and sophisticated name for them in their work in Latin America. Their work domestically was called the Wycliffe Bible Translators. So their methodology and why they were so effective is they go into Catholic Latin America. They say, look, we're there to help the indigenous people. We're going to teach them to read and write in their own language, and then this will make it easier for them to then learn Spanish, and they'll get better integrated into your country culturally and otherwise. But through translating the Bible. So they were proselytizing, but they were doing it under this cloak of being linguists, helping the indigenous people with their culture. And the reason that they did this is a method of pacification. What the big boys were interested in is, again, security. How are we going to go into this area and exploit for oil and not get bows and arrows thrown at us? And so the first thing they relied on was missionaries to pacify resistance. This is the game plan for the conquest of the American West, by the way. And when that doesn't work, other techniques are used. That means lacing blankets with smallpox and dropping candy that has arsenic along riverbeds. And even if that was not sufficient, then the paramilitary would come in and wipe them out.
When I was protesting the war in Vietnam, I often said it wasn't a fight about communism, it was a fight over oil. You could probably write a whole nother book about oil in Asia and in Africa. Do you think that America's involvement in Vietnam was also based a lot about oil?
Nancy, I have been told that, but it certainly would not surprise me.
There are so many conflicts going on in Africa, and we know that there are important mineral resources there. There's oil. African continent has incredible cultures and wildlife ecosystems and wildlife that needs preservation. conservation. Do you think that the colonialism of the Western powers in Africa was, again, because of their desire for the resources?
Of course. Once you understand colonialism, which then becomes imperialism, you understand that it's a struggle for resources. In Africa alone, look at all the countries that border the Red Sea. Where's the Red Sea? Well, it borders Saudi Arabia. So that whole area was actually mapped out. The area of Ethiopia certainly was mapped out by the Italians. They knew there was oil there in the 30s. If you just plug in any of the names there, you will find that there is an oil connection to these conflicts. And of course, it's not just oil. I get that, absolutely. There's copper, for instance, is key. There's gold, and so on. But they are not the fuel of the military. That makes oil the number one resource that's fought over.
I read so many books and interview so many experts on our energy crisis, the climate crisis, the need to do something, and how energy is so related to our current problems regarding the climate and the problems of the climate changing. And yet, so rarely in these other books and articles do I read anything about connecting the oil companies, the pipelines, with our government's wars. Why is that?
It's a wonderful question, and it was very perceptive of you, Nancy, to follow up on that particular issue. I've had incredible difficulty in trying to reach progressive people on the question of the oil. For a while, I was sort of ridiculed with my one-string violin, and it can't just be that. It's more complicated. But in fact, it is that. They're responsible for these wars, and I cannot at this point explain the hesitancy of accepting this. I was recently in an interview with Scott Ritter, the guy who proved the lie of the weapons of mass destruction. He was a weapons inspector in Iraq, if you may remember, and he confirmed what he said. Look, all these wars are about oil. Don't kid yourself. It's about oil. So we've got to finally break through to all the climate activists. I don't know. Some of them is just they can't wrap their heads around it for some reason. The other may be some of their leaders who get funding from certain groups, and those donors do not particularly want the link to be made. So I'm trying to figure that angle out, but it would make the people who, let's call it anti-war, it would make their coalitions a lot stronger if the climate activists were aware of the role that oil and gas play in our wars.
Your writings provide so much background to explain connections between what is going on in the world and the conflicts and our need for energy, and I certainly hope that everyone reads your book, Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil, because it really helps to learn what has gone on in the past to understand what is going on in the present. In your book, I'd like to just close with what you concluded by saying, and if I may quote you, "Who will emerge victorious and set the world on a new path? World leaders who turn a blind eye to the human suffering they are causing because they are beholden to big energy, or an enlightened world citizenry who choose to put the dignity of human beings and the survival of our planet above all else?" You still believe that?
I sure do.
Thank you so very much for doing the work that you're doing and letting the public know what has happened in the past and give us a better understanding of what is going on now. Thank you for being my guest.
Oh, thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I appreciate your work trying to inform people what's going on in the world.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have been speaking with Charlotte Dennett, who is an author, investigative journalist, and attorney. Her latest book, just now out in paperback, is Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.